visuals, live visuals coming in right from outside the presidential palace. We see people there right after we saw much mayhem just a few weeks ago. Today we see a mood of celebration. Ranil Wickremesinghe, who's now taken over as the president of Sri Lanka. We see much joy and celebration at this point. Of course, not a huge crowd like we saw of those protesters. We saw massive numbers who came down to protest, who stormed in to try and take over the presidential palace, and literally many of them infiltrated into the government office there and took siege at that point. Now today we see a different mood, a different picture altogether, where protesters have landed up outside the presidential palace, are celebrating, it appears, and seem quite happy with the development. Ranil Wickremesinghe, who's now elected with 134 votes as the president of Sri Lanka. He's already been the Prime Minister 6 times over. Gaurav Sawant, who's right there at the spot tracking those developments. Gaurav, do you want to explain to us these people who are right now outside the President's Palace, who are celebrating, they're raising slogans and seems like a mood of cheer and joy for them. What exactly is their sentiment there? We know this is not a large crowd, but a small crowd it appears, and they seem to be supporters of someone.
So there are two sets of protesters, one who are chanting "Go Ranil Go," and they are a part of the Janata Aragalai, which is the people's protest or the people's struggle here in Sri Lanka. These are the people who want Ranil Wickremesinghe not to be the president of the country, because they see him as part of the problem and not part of the solution. In fact, when we were speaking to some of the Janata Aragalai leaders yesterday, they were saying in case Ranil Wickremesinghe is elected president, then they would intensify their stir, they would intensify their protest. Of course, they would have to recalibrate their protests, because these are not just inter-university students, federation members and leaders, but also members and leaders of various trade unions in Sri Lanka who've come together to oppose the Gotabaya Rajapaksa dispensation and those who are linked to it. Now, Ranil Wickremesinghe has desperately tried to distance himself from the Gotabaya Rajapaksa dispensation, but the people do not see it as that. People see him as part of the problem and not a part of the solution. But now he is the president of Sri Lanka, so it remains to be seen whether these protests remain whether if security forces are able to control it. They've imposed emergency, there are restrictions on protest, they may protest in a designated spot and not beyond, or does it spread like wildfire like it did last time?
All right, so Gaurav Sawant there explaining to us on the two camps. One camp who are worried that Ranil Wickremesinghe may not be able to pull up a solution, considering that he was a man known close to the Rajapaksas and have opposed to him being the president. But nonetheless, you also have another sect of people within the country who are supporting Ranil Wickremesinghe, and that's the visual that we see here, where supporters of Ranil Wickremesinghe have arrived right outside the presidential palace, are cheering for him, raising slogans, and of course a picture of joy and celebration that we see outside the presidential palace. A stark difference from what we saw just a few weeks ago, where protesters stormed into the presidential palace, literally took siege of that government building in protest against the Rajapaksas continuing in power. In fact, the country we saw has seen an unprecedented economic meltdown, which led to almost a civil war-like situation where citizens stormed onto the streets, taking over many state offices, and that despite the military presence and the military trying hard to calm the situation. Today we're seeing a different scene, a different picture, scenes of some kind of hope that we see outside Presidential Palace. Supporters of Ranil Wickremesinghe who have now gathered, who are now praising the development. Ranil Wickremesinghe has won 134 of the total 219 votes, and it seems like his supporters are right now erupting in joy right outside the President's Palace. And that's the visual, live visual that we bring to you right here. Gaurav Sawant, who's been tracking those developments from Colombo for the last few days, bringing us the most accurate updates. Gaurav, while you see that some of them are still angry with the fact that Ranil Wickremesinghe has been elected as the president, they, like you said, look at him as more of a problem, less of a solution. Do you think that that will be dealt with now Ranil Wickremesinghe solidifying his position? He is no more the interim president, he is now the acting president of Sri Lanka. Do you think he will give out orders, strict orders, to contain any kind of commotion or protest henceforth?
So those orders are already in place, Nabila, ever since emergency was promulgated, and we reported on it 2 days ago. As soon as the announcement was made about elections to be held today, immediately orders were given that there would be no protests anywhere around the parliament. This area was completely barricaded. In fact, we've just sent a report a short while back where you will see Sri Lanka Navy personnel patrolling the waters all around in their speedboats and their water scooters and their jet skis. So you have Sri Lanka Navy, you have Sri Lankan Army, you have Sri Lankan paramilitary forces, SWAT teams, commandos and the Sri Lankan police, and in these multi-tiered barricades. I mean, if you just count the number of barricades, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 layers of barricades here, a couple of layers of barricade beyond. So that's the kind of barricading that has been done here to ensure that there is no breach. Of course, the protesters had also said that they will let the parliamentary process continue unhindered. It's only when the results come will they recalibrate their strategy. And their strategy initially was to take to the streets once again in case Ranil Wickremesinghe was elected. But late last night, despite, yesterday Sajith Premadasa, leader of opposition, announced he didn't have the numbers. So he said he's stepping down in favor of Dallas Alu Peruma. And yet, despite opposition coming in support, he could not garner the numbers. He did not have, he could muster only 84 as against 134 that Ranil Wickremesinghe has almost across most party lines. Which means people, at least the MPs, have hope that he will be able to, perhaps with the national government, should a national government be formed, if a national government is formed, be able to find a solution to the current crisis where perhaps the entire nation needs to be on the same page to come out of the situation, Nabila.